He controlled oil fields worth billions, owned private jets that could circle the globe twice without refueling, and had world leaders on speed dial. But when Omar Hassan Al-Rashid gave his newest employee what he thought was an impossible task, he had no idea that her response would not only shock him to his core, but completely reshape everything he believed about success, loyalty, and the true meaning of wealth. What started as a test of competence became a lesson in humanity that would bring one of the Middle East's most powerful men to his knees. The employee, a soft-spoken woman from Kenya with calloused hands, a worn leather briefcase, and a quiet confidence that concealed secrets even deeper than his own fortune. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the glass towers of Dubai's financial district as Omar Hassan Al-Rashid stepped out of his custom Rolls-Royce Cullinan. At 42, he had built Al-Rashid Enterprises from a single shipping container business inherited from his late father into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that touched every corner of the global economy. Oil refineries in Kuwait, tech, startups in Silicon Valley, luxury resorts in the Maldives, and mining operations across 3 continents all bore his name. But success had come with a price. Omar trusted no one completely, tested everyone ruthlessly, and believed that every person had their breaking point. It was a philosophy that had served him well in the cutthroat world of international business, where handshake deals could vanish with the morning mist and billion-dollar partnerships could crumble over a misplaced comma in a contract. His Dubai headquarters occupied the top 15 floors of the Burj Al-Rashid, a gleaming spire that pierced the sky like a steel and glass exclamation point. The executive floor was a study in controlled opulence, Italian marble floors, so polished they reflected like mirrors, hand-carved Arabian screens that filtered the harsh desert light into gentle patterns, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the Persian Gulf. It was here, in his corner office that morning, that Omar first learned about Amara Wanjiku. "Sir, we have a problem with the Mombasa project," announced his chief operations officer, Rashid Al-Mahdi, as he entered with a tablet clutched in his weathered hands. Rashid was one of the few people Omar had worked with for over a decade, a man whose judgment he had learned to respect, even when it conflicted with his own instincts. The Mombasa project was Omar's latest venture, a massive port expansion that would position Al-Rashid Enterprises as the dominant shipping force along the East African coast. The investment was substantial, $2 billion over 5 years, with the potential to generate returns that would dwarf even his oil revenues. But like all of Omar's international projects, it required local expertise, someone who understood not just the business landscape, but the cultural nuances that could make or break such an ambitious undertaking. "What kind of problem?" Omar asked, not looking up from the financial reports spread across his mahogany desk. He had learned long ago that panic was the enemy of sound business decisions, and his voice carried the calm authority of a man accustomed to solving problems that would paralyze lesser executives. "3 of our top candidates for the regional director position have withdrawn their applications," Rashid replied, setting the tablet down carefully. "The Johannesburg executive cited family concerns. The Lagos candidate took a position with a competitor, and the Cairo prospect simply stopped returning our calls after the 3rd interview." Omar finally looked up, his dark eyes sharp with interest. The regional director position was crucial. This person would oversee not just the construction phase, but the ongoing operations, manage relationships with local governments, and ensure that the project delivered on its ambitious promises. It required someone with exceptional skills, unshakable integrity, and the kind of strategic vision that couldn't be taught in business schools. And our backup candidates. That's where it gets interesting, Rashid said, pulling up a file on his tablet. There's one application that came through unconventional channels. No headhunter, no agency, no corporate connections. She applied directly through our website, attached a handwritten cover letter, and her resume is unusual. Omar leaned back in his leather chair, intrigued despite himself. In his experience, the most interesting opportunities often came from the most unexpected places. Show me. The photograph that appeared on the tablet screen showed a woman in her early 30s with intelligent eyes and a serene expression. She wore a simple blue blazer over a white blouse, no jewelry except for small silver earrings, and her hair was pulled back in a professional but unadorned style. There was something in her gaze, a quiet strength that seemed to look right through the camera and into the viewer's soul. Amara Wanjiku, Rashid read from the file, born in Nairobi, raised in a village outside Nakuru, bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Nairobi, master's in international development from a university in London. But here's what's unusual. She spent 5 years working for a non-profit organization that built schools and medical clinics in rural Kenya, followed by 3 years managing agricultural cooperatives that increased crop yields by an average of 40%. Omar frowned. And her corporate experience? Limited. 2 years with a mid-sized logistics company in Nairobi, where she streamlined their distribution network and reduced costs by 25%. Before that, she ran her own small consulting firm that specialized in helping local businesses access international markets. It wasn't the typical background Omar expected for someone applying to manage a $2 billion infrastructure project. Most candidates for positions at this level came with decades of experience at multinational corporations, advanced degrees from prestigious universities, and networks that spanned continents. This woman's resume read more like that of a social entrepreneur than a corporate executive. What makes you think she's worth considering? Omar asked. Rashid smiled, a rare expression on his usually serious face. Her cover letter. She didn't focus on her qualifications or promised to deliver results that other candidates couldn't. Instead, she wrote 3 pages about the fishing villages along the Kenyan coast, how the families there have been making their living from the sea for generations, and how a port expansion could either destroy their way of life or, if done thoughtfully, create opportunities that would benefit everyone involved. Omar felt a flicker of curiosity. In his world, cover letters were typically exercises in corporate speak, filled with buzzwords and empty promises. A candidate who chose to write about fishing villages was either completely naive about the business world or operating from a completely different playbook. She also included something else, Rashid continued, swiping to another page on the tablet. A detailed analysis of 3 similar port projects in other African countries, one that succeeded, one that failed, and one that achieved mixed results. Her breakdown of the factors that led to each outcome is more insightful than reports we've paid consulting firms hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce. Omar studied the photograph again. There was something about this woman that didn't fit the usual patterns. In his experience, people were motivated by money, power, recognition, or some combination of the 3. But Amara Wanjiku's application suggested someone driven by entirely different forces. Schedule an interview, he decided, but not a standard one. I want to see how she handles pressure, how she thinks when she's pushed outside her comfort zone. What did you have in mind? Omar stood and walked to the windows, looking out at the city he had helped build through decades of calculated risks and strategic investments. Somewhere below, millions of people were going about their daily lives, most of them completely unaware of the decisions made in offices like this. that would shape their futures. "I'm going to give her a task," he said finally. "Something that will test not just her business acumen, but her character. If she's truly different from the others, it will show. And if she's just another opportunist with a more creative presentation, that will show too." Rashid made a note on his tablet. "What kind of task?" Omar turned back to his desk, his mind already working through possibilities. "The task would need to be challenging enough to reveal her true capabilities, impossible enough to see how she responded under pressure, and meaningful enough to demonstrate whether she understood the real stakes involved. I'll know when I meet her," he said. "But whatever it is, it will be unlike anything she's ever encountered before." 3 days later, as Omar prepared for the interview that would change both their lives, he had no idea that he was about to encounter someone who would challenge not just his business assumptions, but his fundamental beliefs about what it meant to be truly successful in an interconnected world. The woman walking through the doors of his headquarters that morning carried with her not just her own ambitions, but the hopes and dreams of communities he had never considered, and a perspective that would force him to question everything he thought he knew about power, responsibility, and the real cost of building empires. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The elevator that carried Amara Wanjiku to the 47th floor of the Burj Al-Rashid was lined with polished black granite and soft amber lighting that made her reflection appear almost ethereal. She had arrived in Dubai 12 hours earlier on a red-eye flight from Nairobi, carrying only a small suitcase and the worn leather briefcase that had belonged to her grandfather, a man who had taught her that true wealth wasn't measured in what you accumulated, but in what you gave back to the world. As the elevator climbed silently through the heart of one of the world's most expensive buildings, Amara reviewed what she knew about Omar Hassan Al-Rashid. The man was legendary in business circles, known for his strategic brilliance and his absolute intolerance for mediocrity. But what intrigued her more were the smaller details she had discovered through her research. His charitable foundation that had quietly funded education initiatives across the Middle East, his habit of visiting project sites personally rather than relying solely on reports, and the fact that despite his immense wealth, he still drove himself to work every morning in the same car he had owned for 7 years. The elevator doors opened with a whisper, revealing a reception area that seemed to float above the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panorama of Dubai's skyline, while carefully placed artwork from across the Arab world created an atmosphere of refined cultural sophistication. Behind a curved reception desk sat a woman whose elegant hijab was perfectly coordinated with her navy blue suit. "Ms. Wanjiku," the receptionist said with a warm smile that carried traces of a Lebanese accent. "Mr. Al-Rashid is ready to see you. Please, follow me." They walked down a corridor, lined with photographs that told the story of Al-Rashid Enterprises' global expansion. Amara recognized images from the company's oil operations in Kuwait, their renewable energy projects in Morocco, and their technology investments in Singapore. But what caught her attention were the smaller photographs interspersed among the corporate achievements, local workers shaking hands with Omar at construction sites, children from company-sponsored schools holding up their diplomas, and community leaders at ribbon-cutting ceremonies for hospitals and clinics. The receptionist paused before a heavy wooden door marked with a simple brass nameplate. "He prefers direct conversation," she said quietly. "No small talk, no elaborate presentations, just honest answers to honest questions." Amara nodded, adjusting the strap of her grandfather's briefcase. She had learned long ago that authenticity was her greatest strength, and she had no intention of trying to be anyone other than herself, regardless of how intimidating this environment might be. The office beyond the door was even more impressive than she had imagined. The space was enormous, with distinct areas for formal meetings, casual conversations, and private work. But what struck her immediately was how the opulence was balanced with personal touches, family photographs on the desk, books in both Arabic and English filling custom shelves, and a traditional Omani coffee service set on a side table. Omar Hassan Al-Rashid stood behind his desk, and Amara was surprised by her first impression. The photographs she had seen in business magazines had captured his authority and intensity, but they had missed something essential, a quality of deep thoughtfulness that seemed to emanate from his dark eyes. He was taller than she had expected, with graying temples that added gravitas to his still youthful face, and when he moved around the desk to greet her, his movements carried the confidence of a man completely comfortable in his own skin. "Ms. Wanjiku," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive, and he maintained eye contact in a way that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "Thank you for making the journey from Nairobi. I trust your flight was comfortable?" "It was, thank you," Amara replied, noting how his question seemed genuinely concerned with her comfort rather than a perfunctory pleasantry. "And thank you for this opportunity. Your offices are remarkable." Omar gestured toward a seating area arranged around a low table. "Please, let's sit somewhere more comfortable. I find that the best conversations happen when people can relax and speak freely." As they settled into leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, Omar poured traditional Arabic coffee from an ornate pot. The ritual was performed with practiced ease, and Amara recognized it as both a gesture of hospitality and a moment for mutual assessment. "Tell me," Omar began, handing her a delicate porcelain cup, "what made you believe you were qualified for a position managing a $2 billion infrastructure project?" It was a direct question that cut straight to the heart of the matter, and Amara appreciated the lack of pretense. "I don't believe I'm qualified in the traditional sense," she said, surprising him with her honesty. "My resume doesn't include the usual markers of success for a position at this level. But I've learned that the most complex challenges aren't solved by conventional thinking." Omar leaned back, intrigued. "Explain." "When I was working with agricultural cooperatives in rural Kenya, I encountered a problem that seemed impossible," Amara continued, her voice gaining strength as she moved into familiar territory. "Farmers were producing excellent crops, but they couldn't access international markets because they lacked the certifications, transportation networks, and quality control systems that large buyers required. Traditional solutions would have cost millions of dollars and taken years to implement. And what did you do?" "I spent 3 months living in one of the farming communities, not as an outside consultant, but as a member of the community. I learned how decisions were made, what resources were actually available, and what the farmers themselves saw as their biggest obstacles. Then I connected them directly with a small specialty foods importer in London who was looking for exactly the type of authentic, sustainably grown products they were producing." Omar set down his coffee cup, giving her his full attention. "The results?" Within 18 months, 7 cooperatives had direct contracts with European buyers. Their income increased by an average of 60%, and they were able to fund their own quality control systems and transportation improvements. The key wasn't imposing external solutions, it was understanding the existing strengths and building on them. "Interesting approach," Omar said, though his expression remained neutral. "But managing agricultural cooperatives is quite different from overseeing a major port development. The scale, the complexity, the political considerations, they're on completely different levels." Amara nodded. "You're absolutely right, but I've learned that scale doesn't change the fundamental principles of good management. Whether you're working with 50 farmers or 50,000 dock workers, success depends on understanding the real needs of all stakeholders and finding solutions that create value for everyone involved. Omar stood and walked to the windows, looking out at the city spread below them. After a long moment, he turned back to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm going to give you a test," he said. "Not a case study or a hypothetical scenario, but a real challenge that will determine whether you join this organization." Amara felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm listening. 3 months ago, we acquired a failing shipping company in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The company owns valuable port facilities and strategic shipping routes, but it's hemorrhaging money and losing customers at an alarming rate. The previous management blamed external factors, government regulations, competition from larger ports, economic instability in the region." Omar returned to his chair, leaning forward with an intensity that filled the room. "I want you to go to Dar es Salaam, assess the situation, and present me with a plan to turn that company around. But here's the challenge. You'll have exactly 30 days, a budget of $50,000, and no authority to make personnel changes or major capital expenditures." Amara felt the weight of the challenge settling over her like a heavy cloak. What Omar was describing was indeed nearly impossible. $50,000 was a tiny fraction of what most consultants would charge just to conduct an assessment, let alone develop and implement a turnaround strategy. 30 days was barely enough time to understand the complexity of a failing shipping operation, much less fix it. "There's one more condition," Omar continued. "You'll be working completely, independently. No support from Al-Rashid Enterprises, no access to our resources or networks, no safety net if things go wrong. You'll succeed or fail entirely on your own merits." The silence in the office stretched between them like a taut wire. Amara understood that this wasn't just a test of her business capabilities, it was a test of her character, her resourcefulness, and her willingness to take risks when the odds were stacked against her. "What happens if I fail?" she asked. Omar's expression remained impassive. "Then you return to Kenya with an interesting story and the knowledge that you attempted something most people wouldn't dare try. And if I succeed, then you'll have demonstrated that you possess something more valuable than any credential or recommendation, the ability to create solutions where others see only problems." Amara stood, extending her hand. "When do I leave for Dar es Salaam?" Omar shook her hand, and for the first time since she had entered his office, she saw a glimmer of what might have been approval in his eyes. "Your flight leaves tomorrow morning. You'll receive the company details and your initial budget transfer within the hour." As Amara walked back toward the elevator, her mind was already racing through possibilities and challenges. She had just accepted what was arguably an impossible task from one of the world's most successful businessmen. But as the elevator descended, through the heart of the gleaming tower, carrying her back toward the bustling streets of Dubai, she felt not fear, but exhilaration. Tomorrow, she would be flying to Tanzania to attempt something that conventional wisdom said couldn't be done. She would be operating without a safety net, with minimal resources, and under the scrutiny of a man who had built an empire by demanding excellence. But she had faced impossible odds before, and she had learned that the most remarkable achievements often came from the most unlikely circumstances. The elevator doors opened, and Amara stepped out into the marble lobby, her grandfather's briefcase in her hand and a challenge that would define her future stretching ahead of her like an uncharted ocean. The Indian Ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon as Amara's Kenya Airways flight began its descent into Julius Nyerere International Airport. Through the small oval window, she could see the sprawling city of Dar es Salaam emerging from the coastal haze, a vibrant mix of colonial architecture, modern skyscrapers, and informal settlements that, seemed to pulse with the rhythm of East African life. The sight stirred something deep within her, a recognition that she was returning to the continent where she belonged, even if this particular challenge would test every skill she had ever developed. The flight had given her 8 hours to study. The preliminary files Omar had provided about coastal maritime solutions, the failing shipping company she was meant to resurrect. The numbers painted a grim picture. Revenues had declined by 40% over the past 2 years. Employee turnover was approaching 60% annually, and customer complaints had increased exponentially. The company operated from a port facility that had once been among Tanzania's most efficient, but now struggled to compete with newer, more modern operations, both within the country and across the region. What troubled Amara most wasn't the financial data. She had seen failing businesses before, but the complete absence of any mention of the human element. The reports detailed cargo tonnage, profit margins, and operational inefficiencies, but said nothing about the hundreds of workers whose livelihoods depended on the company's success, or the local businesses that relied on its services, or the communities that had grown up around the port over decades of operation. As her taxi wound through the busy streets of Dar es Salaam, dodging daladalas packed with commuters and weaving between street vendors, selling everything from fresh fruit to mobile phone credit, Amara felt the familiar energy of African urban life washing over her. This was a world she understood instinctively, a place where resourcefulness mattered more than resources, where relationships trumped regulations, and where solutions often emerged from the most unexpected collaborations. The driver, a middle-aged man named Hassan, who spoke excellent English with a distinctive Tanzanian lilt, proved to be an invaluable source of local knowledge during the 40-minute journey to the port district. "You're here about coastal maritime?" he asked when she mentioned her destination. "That place used to be the pride of Dar es Salaam. My cousin worked there for 15 years before they started laying people off. Good people, hard-working people, but something went wrong in the management." "What do you think went wrong?" Omara asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Hassan shrugged, navigating around a massive truck loaded with construction materials. "New managers came in from overseas, you know. They had big degrees and fancy ideas, but they never learned how things actually work here. They tried to run it like some European port, forgetting that this is Africa. Here, business is about relationships, about understanding people, about building trust over time." It was exactly the kind of insight that never appeared in corporate reports, and Amara made a mental note to spend time talking with more local people before diving into the company's financial records. The Coastal Maritime Solutions Facility occupied a prime location along Dar es Salaam's harbour, with direct access to deep-water berths capable of handling large cargo vessels. The infrastructure was impressive. Massive cranes, extensive warehouse complexes, and sophisticated container handling equipment that represented millions of dollars in investment. But as Hassan's taxi pulled up to the main gate, Amara could see signs of the company's decline everywhere. Paint was peeling from buildings that should have been pristine. Equipment sat idle in areas that should have been bustling with activity. Most telling of all, the parking lot that should have been full of workers' vehicles contained only a handful of cars, and those belonged mostly to security guards and administrative staff. The security guard at the gate examined Amara's credentials with polite suspicion. She had been given temporary access as a consulting analyst, a deliberately vague title that would allow her to move freely through the facility without immediately alerting employees to the true nature of her mission. "Ms. Wanjiku," came a voice from behind her as she stood in the reception area, studying a wall-mounted map of the port's layout. She turned to see a woman in her 50s, approaching with a mixture of curiosity and caution in her expression. "I'm Grace Mwalimu, the operations manager." I understand you're here to conduct some kind of assessment. Grace's handshake was firm, and her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had navigated corporate politics while maintaining her principles. She wore a practical blue pantsuit and sensible shoes, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her job better than anyone else in the building. That's right, Amara replied. I'm hoping to understand how the company operates, what challenges you're facing, and what opportunities might exist for improvement. Grace's smile was polite but guarded. We've had a lot of consultants through here over the past year. Most of them spend a few days looking at spreadsheets, then write reports recommending that we fire half our staff and automate everything. I hope you're planning a different approach. I am, Amara assured her. I'd like to start by understanding the work from the ground up. Would it be possible for me to spend time with your dock workers, your crane operators, your warehouse staff? I learn best by watching and listening. For the first time, Grace's expression showed genuine interest. That's unusual. Most consultants want to start with management meetings and financial reviews. The numbers only tell part of the story, Amara said. I found that the people doing the actual work usually have the best insights about what's really happening and what needs to change. Grace studied her for a moment, then nodded decisively. Let me introduce you to Joseph Kimani. He's been our head dock supervisor for 12 years. If anyone can give you an honest picture of our situation, it's him. They walked through a maze of corridors that spoke to the facility's age and gradual expansion over decades. The walls were lined with safety notices in both English and Swahili, and productivity charts that showed declining performance over recent months, and photographs from better times when the port had been bustling with activity. Joseph Kimani turned out to be a compact man with greying hair and the weathered hands of someone who had spent his career working with heavy machinery and managing complex logistics. When Grace introduced Amara as someone who wanted to understand the port's operations, his initial skepticism was obvious. Another consultant, he asked, in heavily accented English. You here to tell us we need to work harder for less pay? I'm here to listen, Amara replied, switching to Swahili. I want to understand what you see happening here every day. Joseph's eyebrows rose in surprise at hearing his native language, and his posture relaxed slightly. Your Swahili is very good for a Kenyan, he said with a hint of amusement. My grandmother was Tanzanian, Amara explained. She always told me that language is the bridge between hearts. That simple statement seemed to break down the last of Joseph's resistance. Come, he said, gesturing toward the dock area. Let me show you what we're dealing with. The next 3 hours were a revelation. As Joseph guided her through the port's operations, pointing out both strengths and problems, Amara began to see a pattern that had nothing to do with the financial metrics in her briefing files. The facility had excellent infrastructure and skilled workers, but it was being strangled by a management structure that had lost touch with both its employees and its customers. See that crane there? Joseph pointed to a massive piece of equipment that sat motionless despite a cargo ship waiting at the dock. It's been down for maintenance for 6 weeks. We have the parts, we have the expertise to fix it, but the work order has to go through 3 different departments and get 5 different approvals. By the time the paperwork is complete, the ships have gone to other ports. Similar stories emerged throughout the afternoon. Dedicated employees watching in frustration as bureaucratic procedures prevented them from serving customers effectively. Experienced workers being bypassed in favor of expensive outsourced services. Local businesses that had been loyal customers for years being driven away by inflexible policies and unresponsive customer service. But what struck Amara most powerfully was the underlying affection these workers still felt for their company. Despite months of uncertainty, pay cuts, and management decisions that seemed designed to undermine their efforts, they continued to take pride in their work. They spoke with genuine passion about the port's glory days and expressed hope that, somehow, things could be turned around. As the sun began to set over the Indian Ocean, painting the harbour in shades of gold and crimson, Amara stood on the main dock with Joseph, watching the cargo ship that had been waiting all day finally give up and depart for a competing port. "This happens too often now," Joseph said sadly. "Good customers, good business, but they can't wait for us to get our act together." "What would you do if you were in charge?" Amara asked. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, then turned to face her with an expression of deep sincerity. "I would remember that this port exists to serve people. Our customers, our workers, our community. When you forget that, when you start thinking that business is just about numbers on a computer screen, that's when everything starts to fall apart." That evening, in her modest hotel room overlooking the harbour, Amara spread out financial documents across the small table and began to piece together the real story of Coastal Maritime Solutions' decline. The numbers confirmed what she had observed during her first day. This wasn't a company failing because of external market forces or insurmountable structural problems. It was a company being killed by its own management systems. The previous leadership had implemented a series of cost-cutting measures and process improvements that looked impressive on paper, but had systematically destroyed the relationships and flexibility that had made the port successful. In their quest to maximize short-term profits, they had forgotten the fundamental truth that Joseph had articulated so simply: successful businesses exist to serve people. As she worked late into the night, developing the framework for what she was beginning to realize would be a radical turnaround strategy, Amara felt the familiar excitement that came with discovering a solution hidden in plain sight. The challenge Omar had given her was indeed nearly impossible, if approached conventionally. But convention, she was beginning to understand, was exactly what had gotten Coastal Maritime Solutions into this mess in the first place. Outside her window, the lights of the harbour twinkled like stars, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of waves against the shore, a reminder that even in the middle of the most complex human problems, the ocean continued its eternal rhythm, constant and reliable and patient, with the small dramas playing out along its edge. Day 5 of Amara's 30-day challenge dawned with the kind of brilliant African sunrise that made even the most complex problems seem solvable. She had spent the previous evening in her hotel room, not poring over financial spreadsheets as any conventional consultant might have done, but crafting what she privately called her relationship map, a hand-drawn diagram that connected every person she had met at Coastal Maritime Solutions with their concerns, their expertise, and their untapped potential. The breakthrough had come at 2 in the morning when she realized that the company's problems weren't actually business problems at all. They were human problems disguised as business problems. Every bottleneck, every inefficiency, every lost customer could be traced back to a breakdown in communication, trust, or understanding between people who should have been working together toward common goals. Armed with this insight and a plan that would have horrified any traditional business school graduate, Amara arrived at the port before dawn. Her first stop wasn't the executive offices or the operations center, but the small cafeteria where the dock workers gathered for tea before their shifts began. The room fell silent when she entered, carrying a tray with enough chai and mandazi for everyone present. In Tanzanian culture, sharing food was one of the most fundamental expressions of respect and community, and Amara watched as the initial suspicion in the workers' eyes gave way to cautious welcome. "I have a proposal," she announced in fluent Swahili, settling cross-legged on the floor in the traditional manner despite her business attire. "But first, I need to understand something. If you could change just one thing about how this company operates, what would it be?" What followed was the most productive business meeting Amara had ever attended, despite taking place on a cafeteria floor at 6 in the morning. For the next hour, as the sun climbed higher over the Indian Ocean, the workers shared insights that no management consultant had ever bothered to collect. Fatuma, a crane operator with 15 years of experience, explained how the new computerized scheduling system created more problems than it solved because it couldn't account for the realities of weather, tide tables, and the human factors that determined how efficiently cargo could be moved. Mohammed, who supervised the warehouse operations, described how the company had lost 3 major customers, not because of pricing or capacity issues, but because the new customer service protocols were so rigid that they couldn't accommodate the flexible arrangements that had made those relationships profitable for years. Sarah, one of the few women working in the traditionally male-dominated shipping environment, revealed that she had developed an unofficial communication network among port workers that could coordinate complex operations in minutes, but management had never acknowledged or supported this system because it didn't appear on any organizational chart. By the time the meeting ended, Amara had filled 12 pages with notes, but more importantly, she had gained something invaluable: the trust and cooperation of the people who actually made the port function. As the workers headed off to begin their shifts, Joseph Kimani lingered. "Behind, what you're doing is dangerous," he said quietly. "The managers upstairs won't like it if they think you're going around them to talk to us directly." Amara smiled. "Let me worry about the managers, but I need to ask you something important. If I could give you the authority to fix the problems you see every day, would you be willing to take responsibility for the results?" Joseph's eyes widened. "You mean actually make decisions, change how things work?" "I mean exactly that. But it would require you and the other experienced workers to step up in ways you never have before. It would mean taking risks and being accountable for outcomes, not just following orders." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, then nodded firmly. "We've been watching this place die slowly for 2 years. If there's a chance to save it, we have to try." Amara's next stop was Grace Mwalimu's office, where she found the operations manager reviewing a stack of reports that seemed to contain nothing but bad news. Grace looked up with the weary expression of someone who had been fighting losing battles. "For too long. How are your conversations going?" Grace asked. "Learning anything useful from the workers?" "More than useful," Amara replied, settling into the chair across from Grace's desk. "I'm learning that this company has been trying to solve the wrong problems. We've been so focused on cutting costs and improving efficiency that we've forgotten what made us successful in the first place." Grace set down her reports and leaned forward with interest. "Which was relationships, flexibility, the ability to solve problems quickly because everyone knew their role and trusted each other to do their jobs well. The current management structure has replaced trust with bureaucracy, and bureaucracy is killing us. So, what do you propose?" Amara pulled out a folder containing the plan she had developed over the past few days. "I want to try something that will either save this company or get me fired, but I need your support to make it work." The plan she outlined was radical by any conventional business standard. Instead of implementing new procedures or hiring expensive consultants, Amara proposed temporarily dismantling most of the company's formal management hierarchy and replacing it with a network of worker-led teams, each responsible for specific aspects of the port's operations. Joseph would lead a dock operations team with complete authority to schedule cargo handling, coordinate with ship captains, and resolve logistical problems in real time. Fatuma would head an equipment maintenance team empowered to make immediate decisions about repairs and upgrades without waiting for multiple approvals. Sarah would formalize her communication network and give it official status as the company's internal coordination system, You're talking about turning the entire organizational structure upside down, Grace said, though her tone suggested fascination rather than criticism. What about accountability? What about quality control? What about liability? All of those concerns are valid, Amara acknowledged. But they're based on the assumption that workers can't be trusted to make good decisions. What if that assumption is wrong? What if the reason our quality has declined is because we've taken decision-making authority away from the people who understand the work best? Grace studied the plan for several minutes, occasionally asking questions about specific details. Finally, she looked up with an expression that mixed excitement with apprehension. "This could work," she said slowly, "but it could also be a disaster. If we're wrong about the workers' ability to handle this kind of responsibility, then we'll be no worse off than we are now," Amara finished. "But if we're right, we could transform this company in ways that no amount of traditional management consulting could achieve." The real test came that afternoon when Amara presented her plan to the company's senior management team. The conference room on the third floor of the administrative building was a temple to conventional corporate thinking, with its polished table, leather chairs, and wall-mounted monitors displaying endless streams of performance metrics. The 5 managers who assembled to hear her presentation represented everything that had gone wrong with Coastal Maritime Solutions. They were intelligent, well-educated professionals who had been promoted based on their ability to create impressive PowerPoint presentations and navigate corporate politics. But they had lost touch with the actual work of running a port. David Chen, the general manager who had been brought in from a shipping company in Singapore, listened to Amara's proposal with barely concealed skepticism. "Ms. Wanjiku," he said when she finished, "what you're describing isn't management, it's chaos. These workers don't have MBA degrees. They don't understand complex logistics systems. They can't be expected to make strategic decisions." With respect, Amara replied, "They've been making strategic decisions every day. They've just been doing it without official recognition or support. The difference is that now they'll be accountable for the results, instead of being blamed for problems they had no authority to solve." Margaret Thompson, the financial controller, raised another objection. "Even if this worked operationally, we have no framework for measuring performance or ensuring compliance with safety regulations. Our insurance policies, our contracts with customers, our relationship with port authorities, all of these assume a traditional management structure." Omara had anticipated this concern. "I'm not proposing that we abandon oversight or accountability. I'm proposing that we change how we structure both. Instead of measuring compliance through paperwork and procedures, we measure it through results. Instead of preventing problems through rigid controls, we prevent them by empowering the people closest to the work to identify and solve issues before they become crises." The debate continued for over an hour, with the managers raising every conceivable objection, while Amara patiently addressed each concern. But she could see that underneath their resistance lay a deeper fear, the fear that they might not be as essential as they had always believed. Finally, David Chen posed the ultimate challenge. "Let's say, hypothetically, that we agreed to try this experiment. How would we measure success? What metrics would you use to prove that this approach is working?" Amara smiled. "Customer satisfaction, employee retention, on-time delivery rates, equipment uptime, revenue per employee, all the metrics that actually matter for a successful port operation. But I'd also add one more. How many problems get solved at the operational level before they require management intervention?" "And how long would this experiment last?" Margaret asked. 30 days, Amara replied without hesitation. "If the approach doesn't show measurable improvement within 30 days, we revert to the previous system, and I recommend that the company pursue a more conventional turnaround strategy. The managers exchanged glances, engaging in the kind of silent communication that comes from years of working together in corporate environments. Finally, David Chen spoke for the group. "This is highly irregular," he said. "But given our current trajectory, perhaps irregular is what we need. We'll authorize a 30-day trial, but with strict monitoring and the understanding that any safety incidents or customer complaints will end the experiment immediately." As Amara left the conference room, she felt the familiar mixture of exhilaration and terror that came with taking calculated risks. She had just convinced a struggling company to abandon conventional management wisdom in favor of an approach that existed more in her imagination than in any business textbook. But as she walked through the port facility that evening, watching the sun set over the harbor while workers prepared for the night shift, she felt confident that she had made the right choice. The people who loaded cargo, operated cranes, and maintained equipment weren't just following orders. They were craftspeople who took pride in their work and understood their industry better than any outside consultant ever could. Tomorrow, the real test would begin. Either her faith in human potential would be vindicated, or she would learn an expensive lesson about the dangers of challenging established systems. But tonight, for the first time since arriving in Dar es Salaam, the port felt alive with possibility. The transformation began at sunrise on day 8 of Amara's trial period, but it didn't look like any corporate restructuring that had ever been documented in business journals. Instead of formal announcements and organizational charts, it started with Joseph Kimani standing at the center of the main dock, surrounded by 23 workers who had volunteered to be part of what they privately called the experiment. "Today we work differently," Joseph announced, his voice carrying across the harbor in the early morning stillness. "Today, when a ship arrives, we don't wait for 3 departments to approve a loading schedule. We look at the cargo, we look at our equipment, we look at the tides, and we make it happen." The first test came within hours. The cargo vessel Mombasa Star arrived 2 hours ahead of schedule with a full load of tea and coffee bound for European markets. Exactly the kind of time-sensitive cargo that had been driving customers away as the port's response time had deteriorated. Under the old system, this early arrival would have triggered a cascade of procedural delays as supervisors consulted schedules, checked regulations, and sought approvals from multiple departments. Instead, Sarah's newly formalized communication network swung into action. Within 15 minutes, crane operators had been notified, warehouse space had been cleared, and dock workers had assembled at the appropriate berth. By the time the ship's captain had completed the standard arrival procedures, Coastal Maritime Solutions was ready to begin unloading immediately. Fatuma, now empowered to make real-time decisions about equipment allocation, directed 2 cranes to the vessel while simultaneously dispatching a maintenance team to perform routine checks on backup equipment. Mohammed coordinated with truck drivers and warehouse staff to ensure smooth cargo flow from ship to storage to transport vehicles. The entire operation moved with a precision and efficiency that hadn't been seen at the port in over 2 years. Captain Abdallah Mwangi of the Mombasa Star watched the proceedings with amazement. He had been using coastal maritime solutions for 5 years and had grown accustomed to delays, confusion, and the kind of bureaucratic friction that turned simple operations into multi-day ordeals. "What happened here?" he asked Joseph, as the last container was being lifted from his ship. "This is how things used to work, but I thought those days were over." "Maybe they're not," Joseph replied, with a smile that reflected both pride and cautious optimism. "Maybe we just forgot who we were supposed to be serving." The Mombasa Star completed its cargo operations in 6 hours, 3 hours faster than the port's average over the previous year. More importantly, Captain Mwangi left with a restored confidence in coastal maritime solutions and a promise to recommend the port to other shipping companies that had been avoiding Dar es Salaam due to its reputation for delays. Word of the successful operation spread through the port community with remarkable speed. By afternoon, Grace Mwalimu was fielding phone calls from shipping agents who had heard that something had changed at Coastal Maritime Solutions. 3 companies that had suspended their contracts over the previous months inquired about resuming operations. But the real indicator of transformation came from the workers themselves. For the first time in months, the port buzzed with the kind of focused energy that characterized successful organizations. Workers arrived early and stayed late, not because they were required to, but because they felt ownership over their work and pride in their results. Amara spent those first weeks moving invisibly through the facility, observing the changes but resisting the temptation to interfere. She had learned long ago that sustainable transformation had to come from within an organization, not from external pressure or control. Her role was to create conditions for success, then trust the people closest to the work to make it happen. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. On day 12, a miscommunication between the dock team and the warehouse resulted in 2 containers of automotive parts being loaded onto the wrong truck. Under the old system, this mistake would have triggered an investigation, blame assignment, and new procedures designed to prevent similar errors. Under Amara's approach, the teams involved met immediately, identified the root cause, and developed a simple communication protocol that prevented the problem from recurring. The difference, Grace explained to Amara during one of their evening debriefings, is that people aren't afraid to admit mistakes anymore. When you know you have the authority to fix problems, you're more willing to acknowledge them quickly, instead of hiding them until they become crises. The financial results were equally encouraging. Despite using the same equipment, the same facilities, and essentially the same workforce, Coastal Maritime Solutions was handling 30% more cargo than during the same period the previous year. Customer satisfaction scores, measured through informal feedback and repeat business, had improved dramatically. Most remarkably, employee absenteeism had dropped to nearly 0 as workers found renewed purpose and satisfaction in their jobs. David Chen, the general manager who had initially opposed Amara's approach, grudgingly admitted that the results were impressive. "I still don't understand how it works," he confided to her during a brief meeting. "Everything I learned about management suggests that this should be chaos. But the numbers don't lie." "Maybe," Amara suggested gently, "what you learned about management was designed for different circumstances. This approach works here because these workers have deep expertise and genuine commitment to their company's success. All they needed was permission to use their knowledge and authority to act on their insights." The crisis that would test everything came on day 18. Arriving in the form of the cargo ship Atlantic Navigator, a massive vessel carrying electronics, textiles, and manufactured goods with a combined value of over $12 million. The ship's captain, a stern Norwegian named Lars Bjornsson, had a reputation for demanding perfection and had pulled contracts from 2 other African ports over what he considered unacceptable service levels. The Atlantic Navigator was also running behind schedule due to weather delays, creating enormous pressure to complete cargo operations as quickly as possible. Under normal circumstances, this would have been exactly the kind of high-stakes situation that exposed every weakness in a port's operations. But these were no longer normal circumstances. Joseph's team coordinated with Sarah's communication network to mobilize every available resource. Fatuma's equipment crew performed rapid safety checks on all four of the port's major cranes. Mohammed's warehouse team cleared premium storage space and coordinated with transport companies to ensure immediate truck availability. The entire operation was choreographed with military precision, but executed with the flexibility that only comes from empowered, experienced workers making real-time decisions. For the first 8 hours, everything proceeded flawlessly. Containers moved from ship to dock to warehouse to transport vehicles in a seamless flow that impressed even Captain Bjornsson, who was known for finding fault with the most efficient operations. Then, at 3:30 in the afternoon, disaster struck. Crane. Operator James Mbuya was lifting a particularly heavy container when he felt something wrong in the machine's response. Instead of ignoring the subtle vibration as he might have done under the old system, where reporting equipment problems often led to blame and punishment, he immediately stopped the operation and called for Fatuma's maintenance team. The inspection revealed a hydraulic line that was on the verge of complete failure. If it had ruptured while the crane was handling cargo, the resulting accident could have damaged millions of dollars worth of goods, injured or killed workers, and potentially destroyed Coastal Maritime Solutions' relationship with Captain Bjornsson permanently. But under Amara's empowered system, the response was swift and decisive. Fatuma's team isolated the problem, contacted their parts supplier, and began emergency repairs, while Joseph's crew redistributed the remaining cargo operations to the 3 functioning cranes. Sarah's communication network kept everyone informed of status updates and schedule adjustments. Most importantly, Grace Mwalimu personally informed Captain Bjornsson of the situation, explaining exactly what had happened, what was being done to address it, and how the delay would affect his schedule. Instead of hiding the problem or making excuses, the port took full responsibility and focused on solutions. Captain Bjornsson's reaction surprised everyone, including Amara. Instead of threatening to terminate the contract or demanding compensation, he actually thanked Grace for the honest communication and professional response. "In 20 years of shipping," he told her, "I've seen equipment failures at dozens of ports. What impresses me is not that you had a problem, these things happen, but how quickly and competently you handled it. This is exactly the kind of professionalism I expect from my preferred ports." The hydraulic repair was completed in 4 hours, and the Atlantic Navigator finished its cargo operations only 90 minutes behind the original schedule. More significantly, Captain Bjornsson signed a contract for monthly service calls before his ship left the harbor, citing Coastal Maritime Solutions' exceptional operational competence and communication as the deciding factors. That evening, as news of the successful crisis management spread through the port, Amara found herself surrounded by workers who had played key roles in turning a potential disaster into a demonstration of excellence. But what moved her most wasn't their celebration. It was their quiet confidence that they could handle whatever challenges arose in the future. "We're not the same people we were 3 weeks ago," Joseph observed as they stood on the dock watching. The lights of the departing Atlantic Navigator disappear into the darkness of the Indian Ocean. "We're not just following orders anymore. We're thinking, we're solving problems, we're taking responsibility for outcomes." "You were always capable of this," Amara replied. "The only thing that changed was that someone gave you permission to be yourselves." As she walked back to her hotel that night, with 12 days remaining in her 30-day trial, Amara felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. The transformation at Coastal Maritime Solutions had exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. But she knew that the ultimate test still lay ahead. Her final presentation to Omar Hassan Al-Rashid, where she would have to prove that her unconventional approach could deliver the kind of sustainable results that would justify a $2 billion investment in the Mombasa project. The numbers were impressive. The customer feedback was overwhelmingly positive, and the workers had demonstrated capabilities that traditional management systems had systematically suppressed. But would it be enough to convince one of the world's most successful businessmen that empowerment could triumph over control, that trust could generate better results than surveillance, and that the most profound transformations often came not from imposing new systems, but from unleashing the potential that had always existed within people? Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that her approach could sustain itself beyond the initial enthusiasm of change. But tonight, for the first time since accepting Omar's impossible challenge, Amara allowed herself to believe that she might actually succeed. Day 23 of Amara's trial period began with what should have been a moment of triumph. The morning. Newspapers in Dar es Salaam carried a prominent business section article titled "Port Renaissance: How Coastal Maritime Solutions Rediscovered Excellence." The piece, written by a respected shipping industry journalist, detailed the remarkable turnaround and specifically mentioned the innovative management approach that had transformed the facility's operations. But as Amara stood in the port's main administrative building, holding the newspaper and watching the sunrise paint the harbor in shades of gold, she felt an inexplicable unease. The transformation had been almost too successful, the workers' adaptation too seamless, the results too consistently positive. In her experience, sustainable change was never this smooth, and she had learned to be suspicious of situations that appeared too good to be true. Her instincts proved correct within hours. The trouble began with a phone call that Grace Mwalimu received just after 9 in the morning. The caller identified himself as Inspector Robert Mwakaseg from the Tanzania Ports Authority, the government agency responsible for regulating maritime operations throughout the country. Ms. Mwalimu, the inspector's voice carried the bureaucratic authority that could shut down operations with a single report. We've received complaints about safety violations and unauthorized operational procedures at your facility. We're conducting an immediate inspection and will be arriving within the hour. Grace felt her stomach drop. Unscheduled inspections were rare and usually indicated serious problems or political pressure from competitors. More troubling was the timing, coming just as Coastal Maritime Solutions was demonstrating unprecedented success. What specific violations are being alleged? Grace asked, her years of experience teaching her to gather information before panic set in. Unauthorized personnel operating equipment, failure to follow established safety protocols, and circumventing required supervisory oversight, Inspector Mwakasegi replied in the flat tone of someone reading from an official document. We're treating this as a priority investigation. Grace immediately contacted Amara, who was conducting her daily walkthrough of the warehouse operations. When Amara heard about the impending inspection, her expression shifted from concern to something approaching grim satisfaction. Someone doesn't want us to succeed, she said quietly. The question is who and how far they're willing to go to stop us. The inspection team that arrived 90 minutes later consisted of 4 officials in crisp white shirts and dark trousers, carrying clipboards, cameras, and the kind of serious expressions that suggested they expected to find significant violations. Inspector Mwakasegi was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the meticulous manner of someone who took pride in identifying regulatory infractions. What followed was 6 hours of the most thorough inspection. Coastal Maritime Solutions had ever undergone. The officials examined every piece of equipment, reviewed every safety protocol, interviewed workers individually, and scrutinized documentation with the intensity of investigators building a criminal case. But as The inspection progressed. Something unexpected happened. Instead of uncovering the violations that had been reported, the officials found the opposite, a facility operating at safety standards that exceeded regulatory requirements. Equipment was properly maintained, workers were thoroughly trained, and the new communication protocols had actually improved safety coordination rather than compromising it. Joseph Kimani, when questioned about his authority to make operational decisions, produced a detailed log showing every choice he had made over the previous weeks, along with the outcomes and safety considerations that had guided each decision. His knowledge of regulations and best practices was so comprehensive that Inspector Mwakasegi found himself taking notes. Fatuma, challenged about equipment maintenance procedures, led the inspectors through her systematic approach to preventive care and emergency repairs. Her documentation was so thorough and her safety protocols so robust that the officials ended up asking for copies to share with other ports as examples of best practices. Sarah questioned about the informal communication network that had been formalized under Amara's system, demonstrated how the new protocols had eliminated the kind of miscommunications that often led to accidents. Her network had created redundant safety checks that hadn't existed under the previous hierarchical system. By mid-afternoon, it was clear that the inspection was not going as Inspector Mwakaseg had expected. Instead of finding a facility operating recklessly under unauthorized procedures, he had discovered a port that was setting new standards for operational excellence. "I don't understand," he confided quietly to Grace during a brief break. "The complaints we received were very specific. We were told that workers were operating without proper supervision, that safety protocols were being ignored, that the facility was essentially operating in chaos." "Who filed these complaints?" Grace asked. Inspector Mwakasege consulted his notes. "They came through official channels, but the source was identified as a concerned industry professional who requested anonymity. Amara, who had been observing the inspection from a respectful distance, felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Someone with detailed knowledge of the port's operations had deliberately filed false reports, timing them to coincide with the critical final week of her trial period. This wasn't random regulatory oversight, it was targeted sabotage. The inspection concluded at 5 in the evening, with Inspector Mwakaseje formally declaring that Coastal Maritime Solutions was in full compliance with all applicable regulations and, in many cases, exceeded minimum requirements. His final report would commend the facility for its operational excellence and innovative safety protocols. But as the inspection team packed their equipment and prepared to leave, Inspector Mwakasege pulled Grace aside for a private conversation. "Someone wanted us to find problems here," he said quietly. "The complaints were detailed enough to suggest insider knowledge, but everything we found contradicted the allegations. Be careful, Ms. Mwalimu. When businesses start succeeding in ways that threaten established interests, they sometimes face pushback from unexpected sources." That evening, Amara called an emergency meeting with Grace, Joseph, Fatuma, Sarah, and the other team leaders who had driven the port's transformation. They gathered in the small conference room that had witnessed so many futile management meetings over the previous months. But the atmosphere now was charged with the kind of focused energy that came from people who had been tested and emerged stronger. "Someone tried to sabotage us today," Amara began without preamble. "The inspection was based on false reports filed by someone who knows our operations intimately. We need to figure out who and why. Could it be one of the managers who opposed the changes?" Sarah suggested. "Some of them weren't happy about losing authority." Grace shook her head. "I've been watching them carefully. David Chen and the others have been skeptical, but they've also seen the results. They're pragmatic enough to support something that's working, even if they don't understand it." Joseph had been quiet during the discussion, but now he spoke with the kind of certainty that came from years of observing workplace dynamics. "It's not someone inside the company," he said. "It's someone who benefits from our failure." "What do you mean?" Amara asked. "Think about it," Joseph continued. "For the past 2 years, Coastal Maritime Solutions has been losing customers to competitors. Our failure has been their success. Now we're winning back business, handling cargo more efficiently, attracting customers who had given up on us. Someone is losing money because we're succeeding." The implications of Joseph's observation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. If he was right, the sabotage attempt wasn't just about opposing change within the company. It was about protecting market share and competitive advantage. Fatuma, who had been studying shipping industry publications as part of her expanded role, confirmed Joseph's theory. "I've been tracking cargo volumes at other ports in the region," she said. 3 facilities have reported declining business over the past month, exactly when our numbers started improving." "Which ports?" Grace asked. "Pemba Maritime, Northern Logistics, and East Africa Shipping Hub," Fatuma replied. "All private companies that compete directly with us for the same customer base." Amara felt the familiar surge of determination that came when a complex problem suddenly revealed its true nature. If competition is behind the sabotage attempts, then our success threatens them more than we realized, which means we're on the right track, but we need to be prepared for more attacks. "What kind of attacks?" Sarah asked. "Regulatory complaints were just the beginning," Amara explained. "They could try to poach our key customers with below-cost pricing, spread rumors about our reliability, or even attempt to recruit our most valuable workers. We need to be ready for anything." Grace looked around the table at the faces of people who had transformed from demoralized employees into confident leaders over the course of 3 weeks. "What do? We do what we've been doing," Amara said firmly. "We focus on serving our customers better than anyone else can. We continue to prove that empowered workers deliver better results than controlled workers. And we document everything because the ultimate protection against false accusations is irrefutable evidence of excellence." Joseph nodded. "And we stick together. They're trying to divide us, to make us doubt what we've accomplished. But we know what we've built here is real." The meeting ended with renewed commitment, but Amara lingered in the conference room after. The others had left, staring out at the harbor where the lights of ships created constellations on the dark water. She had 7 days remaining in her 30-day trial, and the opposition had revealed itself as more sophisticated and determined than she had anticipated. But as she reflected on the day's events, she realized that the sabotage attempt had actually strengthened her position. The regulatory inspection had provided independent validation of the transformation's success. The workers had demonstrated grace under pressure and loyalty to their shared mission. Most importantly, the attempt to undermine their progress had only served to expose the threat that their success posed to established interests. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she was certain that her opponents would escalate their efforts as the trial period neared its end. But tonight, she felt more confident than ever that she had chosen the right approach and the right people to implement it. The transformation at Coastal Maritime Solutions wasn't just a business turnaround, it was proof that ordinary people, given trust and authority, could achieve extraordinary results, and no amount of sabotage could change that fundamental truth. As she finally headed back to her hotel, Amara's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Your 30 days are almost up. Are you ready to face the consequences of your choices?" She stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Whoever was behind the sabotage had just made a critical mistake. They had revealed that they knew exactly how much time remained in her trial period. which meant they were counting down the days just as carefully as she was, and they were preparing for a final confrontation that would determine not just her future, but the future of everyone who had dared to believe that change was possible. Day 28 arrived with the weight of inevitability. Amara stood in her hotel room before dawn, looking out at the Indian Ocean as it caught the first light of what would be one of the most crucial days of her professional life. In 48 hours, she would board a flight back to Dubai to present her results to Omar Hassan Al-Rashid. The success or failure of her 30-day experiment would determine not just her own future, but the fate of hundreds of workers who had dared to trust in a different vision of what their company could become. But first, she had to survive whatever final assault her unknown enemies had planned. The attack came in the form of Marcus Steenberg, a man whose name carried weight throughout the East African shipping industry. Steenberg was the CEO of Maritime Solutions International, a consulting firm that specialized in rescuing failing port operations through aggressive cost-cutting and systematic restructuring. His methods were legendary for their efficiency and ruthlessness. He could turn around a struggling facility in 3 months, but the human cost was always devastating. Steenberg arrived at Coastal Maritime Solutions at 9 in the morning, accompanied by 2 assistants and carrying an authority that seemed to bend reality around his presence. He was a tall, silver-haired man in his 60s who wore his expensive suit like armor and spoke with the kind of confidence that came from decades of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Grace Mwalimu met him in the main reception area, immediately sensing that this was not a routine business visit. "Mr. Steenberg," she said cautiously, "we weren't expecting you. How can we help you today?" "I'm here to conduct a management assessment," Steenberg replied, his South African accent carrying undertones of absolute authority. "Al-Rashid Enterprises has commissioned my firm to evaluate the current operational status and provide recommendations for sustainable improvement." Grace felt the words hit her like physical blows. If Omar had sent Steenberg to evaluate the port, it could only mean one thing. He had lost confidence in Amara's approach and was preparing to implement a conventional turnaround strategy. Everything they had accomplished over the past month was about to be swept away by the kind of systematic restructuring that would eliminate jobs, destroy morale, and reduce the port to just another efficient but soulless operation. "I need to contact Ms. Wanjiku," Grace said, reaching for her phone. "That won't be necessary," Steenberg interrupted smoothly. "Ms. Wanjiku's trial period is effectively concluded. I'm here to assess the situation objectively and prepare for the transition to professional management." Word of Steenberg's arrival spread through the port like wildfire. Within an hour, the atmosphere that had been charged with confidence and purpose for weeks suddenly felt heavy with dread. Workers who had embraced their expanded responsibilities now faced the prospect of returning to rigid hierarchies and external control. Joseph Kimani found Amara in the warehouse, where she was reviewing cargo manifests with Mohammed's team. His expression carried the kind of devastation that comes from watching hope transform into despair in real time. "They're saying he's here to fire half of us," Joseph said quietly. "That everything we've done was just a temporary experiment before the real experts take over." Amara felt anger rising in her chest, but forced herself to maintain the calm demeanor that had served her well throughout the month. "Let's not assume anything," she said. "Let me find out what's really happening." But even as she spoke the words, Amara suspected that she had been outmaneuvered by forces more sophisticated than she had imagined. The timing was too perfect, the authority too complete. Someone had convinced Omar that her approach needed to be abandoned, just as it was proving most successful. She found Steenberg in the main conference room, where he had set up a temporary command center, complete with laptops, tablets, and stacks of documents. His assistants were conducting interviews with workers, and she could see from their faces that the questions were designed to identify inefficiencies and redundancies rather than acknowledge successes. "Mr. Steenberg," Amara said, entering the room with the kind of directness that had characterized her entire approach to the challenge. "I wasn't aware that Al-Rashid Enterprises had engaged additional consultants." Steenberg looked up from his laptop with the expression of someone mildly annoyed by an interruption. "Ms. Wanjiku, I've heard interesting things about your unconventional methods, but Mr. Al-Rashid has asked me to provide a professional assessment of the situation here." "Based on what criteria?" Amara asked. "The operational results over the past month have exceeded every benchmark for success. Short-term improvements are often unsustainable," Steenberg replied with the patronizing tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. "What matters is building systems that can deliver consistent results, regardless of individual personalities or temporary enthusiasm. From what I've observed so far, you've created dependencies on specific workers rather than establishing robust, operational frameworks." Amara felt the familiar surge of determination that came when someone challenged the fundamental principles she believed in. "Those specific workers are the people who actually understand this operation better than any external consultant ever could. They're not dependencies, they're assets that previous management failed to utilize effectively. Perhaps," Steenberg conceded with a dismissive wave, "but sustainable business success requires professional management, documented procedures, and accountability structures that don't rely on personal relationships or cultural factors." The conversation was interrupted by Grace, who entered the conference room with an expression of barely controlled fury. "I just received a call from David Chen," she announced. "He's been contacted directly by someone claiming to represent Al-Rashid Enterprises, offering him a promotion to Regional Operations Director if he cooperates with a transition assessment." Amara felt pieces of a complex puzzle suddenly arranging themselves into a clear picture. Who made the contact? "Someone identifying himself as Rashid Al-Mahdi, Mr. Al-Rashid's Chief Operations Officer," Grace replied. "But when I called the Dubai office to verify, they said Al-Mahdi was in meetings all morning and hadn't made any calls to Tanzania." Steenberg's expression remained neutral, but Amara noticed a slight tension in his posture that suggested this revelation was not part of his planned script. "There must be some confusion," he said smoothly. "Communications between different time zones can sometimes create misunderstandings." But Amara was no longer listening to his explanations. She was remembering the anonymous text message from 2 days earlier, the precisely timed regulatory inspection, and the sophisticated nature of the sabotage attempts. Someone with detailed knowledge of Al-Rashid Enterprises operations was orchestrating a campaign to discredit her work and install their own preferred solution. "Mr. Steenberg," she said quietly, "may I see your authorization from Al-Rashid Enterprises?" For the first time since entering the building, Steenberg hesitated. "The arrangements were made at a very senior level," he said. "The documentation is being processed through appropriate channels, which means you don't have any," Amara concluded. "You're here based on someone's representation that they could authorize your engagement, but you haven't actually been hired by Omar Al-Rashid." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Steenberg's assistants stopped their interviews and looked toward their boss with expressions of growing uncertainty. Grace stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, her years of experience in corporate politics allowing her to recognize the signs of a scheme unraveling. "I think," Amara said with the kind of calm authority that commanded attention, that you should contact Omar Al-Rashid directly before proceeding any further. Because if you're here under false pretenses, you're not just undermining my work, you're committing fraud against one of the most powerful businessmen in the Middle East. Steenberg's professional composure finally cracked. The shipping industry in this region needs professional management, he said with rising anger. These amateur experiments with worker empowerment and cultural sensitivity are interesting academic exercises, but they don't create sustainable business value. Someone needs to implement real solutions before this facility becomes another African port operation that destroys shareholder value through misguided idealism. The mask had finally slipped, revealing the fundamental prejudice that drove Steenberg's opposition. In his view, African workers couldn't be trusted with real responsibility. Local knowledge was less valuable than international expertise, and cultural factors were obstacles to be overcome rather than assets to be leveraged. "Get out," Grace said with quiet fury. "Get out of our facility before I call security and have you removed for trespassing." Steenberg gathered his materials with as much dignity as he could muster, but his departure felt more like a retreat than a strategic withdrawal. As his rental car disappeared through the port's main gate, Amara felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had won this particular battle, but the war was far from over. "Who do you think is behind this?" Grace asked as they stood in the conference room, looking at the scattered papers Steenberg had left behind in his haste to depart. "Someone who stands to lose a lot of money if our approach succeeds," Amara replied. "But more than that, someone who fundamentally believes that African workers and African solutions are inherently inferior to Western alternatives." Joseph appeared in the doorway, followed by Fatuma, Sarah, and a dozen other workers who had heard about the confrontation. "Is it true?" he asked. "Are they really trying to shut down everything we've built?" Amara looked at the faces surrounding her, people who had discovered their own capabilities over the past month, who had taken pride in their work and responsibility for their outcomes, who had proven that trust and empowerment could generate results that control and hierarchy never could. "They're trying," she said firmly, "but they've made a fundamental mistake. They think this transformation is about me, about some external consultant imposing a foreign methodology. They don't understand that the change came from you, from your knowledge and your commitment and your willingness to take responsibility for excellence." "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. Amara checked her watch. In 36 hours, she would be sitting across from Omar Al-Rashid, presenting the results of her 30-day experiment. She had documentation of unprecedented operational improvements, customer satisfaction scores that exceeded industry standards, and financial results that proved sustainable profitability. But she also had evidence of a sophisticated campaign to undermine her work, suggesting that powerful interests viewed her success as a threat to established business models. "Now," she said, with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you've chosen the right path regardless of the obstacles, "we prepare for the most important presentation of our lives. Because tomorrow, we're going to prove to Omar Al-Rashid that his most impossible task has been accomplished by the people he least expected to succeed." As the workers dispersed to return to their duties, Grace lingered behind with a concerned expression. "Amara," she said quietly, "what if they're not done? What if they try something else before you leave for Dubai?" Amara had been wondering the same thing. The sabotage attempts had escalated from regulatory complaints to impersonation, fraud, suggesting an opponent with both resources and desperation. There was still 24 hours for one final assault on everything they had built. "Then we'll handle it the same way we've handled everything else," she replied, "together, with transparency, and with absolute commitment to the truth." But as she spoke the words, Amara felt a chill of premonition. Her enemies had revealed themselves as more sophisticated and determined than she had anticipated, and people who were willing to commit fraud were probably willing to do much worse if their initial strategies failed. Day 29 dawned with an ominous stillness that reminded Amara of the moments before tropical storms, when the air itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what was coming. She had spent the night in her hotel room, not sleeping, but preparing for what she knew would be the most important presentation of her career. Her flight to Dubai departed at 6 that evening, giving her 12 hours to finalize her documentation and ensure that Coastal Maritime Solutions could continue operating seamlessly in her absence. But as she walked through the port facility, for what might be the last time, Amara sensed an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with her impending departure. Workers moved with purpose, but their conversations were hushed and their glances carried the wariness of people expecting trouble. Something was building beneath the surface, and she suspected that her enemies had prepared one final assault, designed to discredit everything she had accomplished. The first sign of trouble came at 9 in the morning, when Grace burst into the temporary office where Amara was reviewing financial reports with Mohammed's warehouse team. Grace's face was flushed with anger, and her usually impeccable composure had given way to barely controlled fury. "We have a problem," Grace announced, holding up her phone. "I just received a call from the Tanzanian Revenue Authority. They're sending investigators to examine our payroll records, tax compliance, and employee classification procedures. Someone has alleged that we're operating an illegal labor scheme." Amara felt her heart sink. Tax investigations were perhaps the most effective weapon that could be deployed against any African business, combining the threat of massive penalties with the disruption of normal operations. Even if the allegations were completely false, the investigation process could paralyze the company for weeks or months. "What specific allegations?" she asked, her mind already working through possible responses. "According to the investigator I spoke with, someone has claimed that we're misclassifying employees to avoid tax obligations, operating without proper work permits for foreign consultants, and using informal payment systems that circumvent government." "A revenue collection," Grace replied. Mohammed, who had been quiet during the exchange, suddenly looked up from the shipping manifests he'd been reviewing. "That's very specific knowledge," he observed. "Whoever made these allegations knows our internal operations better than most of our own managers." Amara nodded grimly. The pattern was becoming clear. Each sabotage attempt had been more sophisticated than the last, suggesting an opponent with both detailed inside knowledge and significant resources. But this latest assault revealed something else: desperation. Tax allegations were the nuclear option in business warfare, used only when subtler methods had failed. "How long before the investigators arrive?" she asked. 2 hours, Grace replied. "And Amara, there's something else. David Chen received another call this morning, this time from someone claiming to be a lawyer representing Al-Rashid Enterprises. They offered him a signed contract for a position in Dubai if he would provide documentation of operational irregularities during your trial period." The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together in Amara's mind. Her opponents weren't just trying to discredit her work. They were building a comprehensive case designed to convince Omar that her approach was not just unsuccessful, but actually dangerous. By the time she arrived in Dubai that evening, they intended to have created a narrative of tax violations, operational chaos, and management incompetence that would make her claims of success appear either delusional or fraudulent. "We need to get ahead of this," Amara said decisively. "If they want to play games with documentation and official procedures, then we'll give them more documentation than they can handle." What followed was the most intense 4 hours of collaborative work that Coastal Maritime Solutions had ever experienced. Instead of panicking or retreating in the face of the tax investigation, every department mobilized to create the most comprehensive operational record that any port facility had ever assembled. Joseph's dock operations team compiled detailed logs of every cargo movement, safety procedure, and efficiency improvement over the past month. Fatuma's maintenance crew produced complete records of equipment performance, repair schedules, and cost savings achieved through proactive maintenance. Sarah's communication network documented every decision-making process, showing how the new empowerment structure had actually increased accountability rather than reducing it. Most impressively, the financial records that Mohammed's team assembled painted a picture of operational excellence that would have been impossible to achieve under traditional management approaches. Revenue per employee had increased by 43%, customer satisfaction scores had reached unprecedented levels, and operational costs had decreased even as service quality improved dramatically. When the tax investigators arrived at noon, they found not a disorganized operation trying to hide violations, but a meticulously documented business that exceeded compliance standards in every measurable category. The lead investigator, a stern woman named Dr. Agnes Mwambungu, had clearly expected to find the kind of irregular practices that characterized many struggling businesses. Instead, she discovered what appeared to be a model of operational transparency. These records are unusually comprehensive, Dr. Mwambungu observed as she reviewed the documentation that Grace had prepared. Most facilities our size struggle to provide this level of detail, even when they have weeks to prepare. We believe in accountability, Grace replied simply. When workers have real responsibility for outcomes, they naturally maintain better records because they understand the importance of demonstrating results. The investigation continued for 3 hours, but its tone shifted dramatically as the evidence mounted. Instead of finding violations, the investigators discovered innovative practices that other facilities might want to emulate. The worker empowerment system that Amara's opponents had portrayed as chaotic actually produced more rigorous oversight than traditional hierarchical management. Dr. Mwambungu's final assessment was delivered with the kind of professional respect that comes from encountering genuine excellence. Not only are you in full compliance with all applicable regulations, she told Grace, but your operational documentation sets a new standard for transparency and accountability. I'll be recommending your facility as a best practice example for other port operations. As the investigators departed, Amara felt a mixture of relief and vindication. Every attack from her opponents had been turned into an opportunity to demonstrate the strength of what they had built together. But she also knew that this was likely the final assault before her ultimate test with Omar Al-Rashid. That afternoon, as she prepared to leave for the airport, Amara gathered with the core team that had made the transformation possible. They met in the same small conference room where she had first outlined her radical approach 4 weeks earlier, but the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of uncertainty and skepticism, the room buzzed with quiet confidence and shared purpose. "I want you to know," she began, looking around at faces that had become familiar and dear over the past month, "that regardless of what happens in Dubai tomorrow, you've already succeeded beyond anything I imagined when we started this experiment." Joseph leaned forward with the intensity that had characterized all his interactions since taking on expanded responsibility. "What if Mr. Al-Rashid doesn't understand what we've accomplished here? What if he listens to people who think African workers can't handle real authority? Then we'll continue doing what we're doing," Grace replied before Amara could respond. "Because we know it works, we know it's right, and we know it creates value for everyone involved." Fatuma nodded in agreement. "The customers who come here now leave satisfied. The workers who show up every day feel proud of their contributions. The company is profitable and growing. Those are facts that can't be argued with. Sarah, who had emerged as one of the most thoughtful voices in the group, raised a different concern. But what about the people who've been trying to sabotage us? They're not going to stop just because we've survived their attacks so far. Amara had been thinking about the same issue. The sophistication and persistence of the opposition suggested enemies with both resources and long-term strategic thinking. Even if she succeeded in convincing Omar to support her approach, the broader battle over African business capabilities would continue. "You're right," she acknowledged. "But here's what I've learned over the past month. When people are empowered to succeed, when they're trusted with real responsibility, when they're recognized for their knowledge and capabilities, they become very difficult to defeat. Not because they're protected by external authority, but because they've discovered their own strength." Mohammed, who had been quiet during most of the conversation, suddenly spoke with passion that surprised everyone. "6 months ago, I was just following orders, doing what I was told, hoping to avoid blame when things went wrong. Now I make decisions that affect millions of dollars worth of cargo, and I know that my knowledge and judgment are valued. You can't take that away from someone once they've experienced it." As the meeting concluded and Amara prepared to leave for the airport, each team member approached her with words of gratitude and support that moved her more deeply than any professional recognition she had ever received. But it was Joseph's final comment that captured the essence of what they had accomplished together. "You came here to save a failing company," he said as they stood on the dock where her transformation had begun. "But what you really did was remind us of who we always were underneath all the bureaucracy and fear. Whatever happens tomorrow, that's something no one can take away." The flight to Dubai gave Amara 6 hours to reflect on the month that had changed not just her career, but her understanding of what was possible when people were trusted to rise to the level of expectations placed upon them. She had arrived in Dar es Salaam with a theory about empowerment and a hope that conventional business wisdom might be wrong. She was returning to Dubai with proof that the most profound transformations happen not when new systems were imposed from outside, but when existing capabilities were recognized and unleashed. As the Emirates airline flight descended through the night sky toward Dubai International Airport, Amara could see the glittering towers of the city spreading out below like a constellation of human ambition. Somewhere in that maze of glass and steel, Omar Hassan Al-Rashid was waiting for her report on the impossible task he had assigned 30 days earlier. In her carry-on bag, she carried documentation of operational improvements that exceeded every benchmark for success, financial results that proved sustainable profitability, and testimonials from customers who had rediscovered confidence in coastal maritime solutions. But more importantly, she carried the knowledge that she had witnessed something extraordinary, the transformation that occurs when people are trusted to be their best selves. Tomorrow morning, she would stand before one of the world's most successful businessmen and attempt to convince him that his most valuable investment might not be in new technology or external expertise, but in recognizing the potential that already existed within the people who did the actual work of building his empire. The plane touched down in Dubai at 11:30 that night, and as Amara walked through the familiar corridors of the airport, where her journey had begun exactly 30 days earlier, she felt ready for whatever challenges awaited her in the gleaming towers of Al-Rashid Enterprises. The executive elevator in the Burj Al-Rashid climbed through 47 floors of silence, carrying Amara toward a meeting that would determine not just her future, but the future of everyone who had dared to believe in a different way of doing business. It was exactly 30 days since she had first stepped into Omar Hassan Al-Rashid's office, and as the Dubai skyline spread out beneath her through the elevator's glass walls, she reflected on how much had changed since that first impossible challenge. Omar was waiting for her in the same office, but his demeanor was markedly different from their initial meeting. Instead of the calculating assessment of a man testing an unknown quantity, his expression carried the focused attention of someone preparing to evaluate results that would influence decisions worth billions of dollars. "Ms. Wanjiku," he said, rising from behind his desk, "I trust your flight was comfortable. Please, let's sit where we can speak freely." As they settled into the familiar seating area where their partnership had begun, Omar's first question surprised her with its directness. "Before we discuss your results, I need to address something troubling. Over the past week, I've received several communications from individuals claiming to represent various authorities, suggesting that your experiment in Tanzania was compromised by serious irregularities." Amara felt her heart rate increase, but kept her voice steady. "What kind of communications?" "Allegations of safety violations, tax irregularities, operational chaos," Omar replied, watching her face carefully. "Someone has been very eager to convince me that your approach was not just unsuccessful, but actually dangerous." "And what did you conclude from these communications?" Amara asked. Omar's expression shifted into something that might have been amusement. "I concluded that someone was very afraid of what you might have accomplished. When people resort to anonymous accusations and unverifiable claims, it usually means they lack the confidence to challenge you directly." Relief flooded through Amara, but she maintained her professional composure. "I'm prepared to address every allegation that's been made, but I'd prefer to start with the actual results." "Please do." What followed was the most comprehensive business presentation Amara had ever delivered, but it was unlike any corporate report that had ever been presented in that office. Instead of beginning with financial metrics and operational statistics, she started with people. "30 days ago you sent me to fix a failing shipping company," she began, "but what I discovered wasn't a business problem, it was a human problem. Coastal Maritime Solutions wasn't failing because of market conditions or competitive pressures. It was failing because an entire workforce had been systematically prevented from using their knowledge, their experience, and their commitment to excellence." She opened her laptop and displayed the first slide. Not a graph or chart, but a photograph of Joseph Kimani standing beside the main dock crane, his face reflecting the quiet pride of someone who had rediscovered his own capabilities. "This is Joseph. He's been managing dock operations for 12 years, but under the previous system, he couldn't authorize equipment repairs without approval from 3 different departments. Ships would wait for days while paperwork moved through bureaucratic channels." The next slide showed Fatuma examining hydraulic systems with the focused attention of a master craftsperson. "This is Fatuma. She understands every piece of equipment in that facility better than any external consultant ever could, but her expertise was ignored in favor of expensive maintenance contracts with foreign companies." Omar leaned forward, his business instincts recognizing that he was hearing something fundamentally different from the usual consultant presentations filled with process improvements and cost reductions. "What I did," Amara continued, "was eliminate the barriers that prevented these experts from doing their jobs. Instead of imposing new systems, I removed the old systems that were choking the life out of the operation." The financial results that followed were stunning even by Omar's standards. Revenue had increased 43%. Customer satisfaction had reached levels that surpassed industry benchmarks. Operational costs had decreased while service quality improved dramatically. Equipment downtime had been reduced by 60% through proactive maintenance that workers could now authorize themselves. But it was the human metrics that truly captured Omar's attention. Employee turnover had dropped to virtually zero. Absenteeism had disappeared. Worker productivity had increased not through pressure or incentives, but through genuine engagement and ownership of outcomes. "These results are remarkable," Omar said quietly, But sustainable business transformation requires more than short-term improvements. How do you know this approach will continue working after you leave? Amara smiled, remembering her final conversation with the team in Dar es Salaam. Because the transformation didn't depend on me. I didn't teach them new skills or impose new procedures. I simply removed the obstacles that prevented them from using capabilities they already possessed. She displayed a series of emails that had arrived during her flight to Dubai, customer testimonials praising the port's responsiveness and reliability, shipping agents requesting to add coastal maritime solutions to their preferred provider lists, government officials commending the facility's operational excellence and regulatory compliance. "This is what happened while I was traveling here yesterday," she said. "The team continued operating at peak efficiency because they're not following my instructions. They're applying their own expertise with the authority to act on their knowledge." Omar stood and walked to the windows, looking out at the city he had helped build through decades of strategic investments. When he turned back, his expression carried a gravity that filled the room. "What you're describing challenges fundamental assumptions about business management," he said. "The idea that local workers, especially in developing economies, can outperform international experts and sophisticated systems, it runs counter to everything the business world accepts as proven wisdom." "With respect," Amara replied, "the business world's proven wisdom has produced a lot of failing companies and disengaged workers. Maybe it's time to question whether those assumptions are actually true." The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours, covering everything from management theory to cultural dynamics to the economics of human potential. Omar tested every aspect of Amara's approach with the analytical rigor that had made him one of the world's most successful businessmen, but he couldn't argue with the results. Finally, as the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the Dubai skyline, Omar returned to his desk and opened a folder that had been waiting there throughout their meeting. "Ms. Wanjiku," he said, "I have a confession to make. The Mombasa port project wasn't the only reason I gave you this challenge." Amara felt a flutter of uncertainty. "What do you mean?" "For the past 5 years, I've been investing in infrastructure projects across Africa, but the results have been consistently disappointing, not because of technical failures or financial problems, but because we've been approaching every project as if local populations were obstacles to overcome rather than assets to leverage." He opened the folder and extracted a series of documents. "I've been receiving reports about your work in Tanzania, not just from official sources, but from competitors who are concerned that your success threatens their business models. Companies that profit from African inefficiency have been working very hard to convince me that your approach is dangerous." The pieces suddenly fell into place for Amara. The sabotage attempts hadn't been random attacks from unknown enemies. They had been coordinated efforts by established consulting firms and international contractors who profited from the assumption that African workers couldn't handle sophisticated operations. "But here's what those competitors don't understand," Omar continued. "I didn't become successful by accepting conventional wisdom. I became successful by recognizing opportunities that others missed. And what you've shown me is the biggest opportunity I've ever encountered." He slid a contract across the desk. "I'm not just approving the Mombasa project. I'm restructuring our entire African operations strategy around your approach. Instead of importing external management and foreign expertise, we're going to empower local workers and build on existing capabilities." Amara stared at the document, hardly believing what she was seeing. The contract didn't just offer her a position. It offered her the authority to transform Al-Rashid Enterprises' approach to development across an entire continent. "The economic impact will be extraordinary," Omar said, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who had discovered a revolutionary strategy. "But more than that, You've shown me something I had forgotten in decades of building corporate empires. The most powerful force in business isn't control, it's trust. As Amara signed the contract that would change the trajectory of her career and potentially the lives of thousands of workers across Africa, Omar made one final observation that would stay with her forever. "You accepted what I thought was an impossible task," he said, "but you didn't try to achieve the impossible. Instead, you showed me that what I thought was impossible was actually inevitable, once the right conditions were created for people to succeed." 6 months later, Amara stood on a dock in Mombasa, watching as Joseph, Grace, Fatuma, and Sarah trained a new generation of port managers in the principles that had transformed coastal maritime solutions. The approach that had begun as a desperate experiment was now being implemented across 12 African countries, proving that the most profound changes in business happened not when new systems were imposed, but when existing potential was finally recognized and unleashed. The impossible task had been completed, but its real achievement wasn't saving a failing company or convincing a billionaire to change his strategy. Its real achievement was proving that ordinary people, given trust and authority, could accomplish extraordinary things, and that the most valuable investment any leader could make was in recognizing the capabilities that had always existed within the people who did the actual work of building the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.